Chapter 1. The Forgotten Scroll. It was the third hour before dawn, and the mist had already pressed in close against the broken walls of the monastery of St. Ambrose. Outside, the orchard had vanished beneath a silver flood, the apple trees no longer visible beyond the window arches, their leafless limbs reduced to smudges within a vapour that neither rose nor settled but hovered, purposeful and implacable, like breath held by the land itself. Brother Felric, the oldest monk in the house, sat alone in the scriptorium, wrapped in 3 threadbare habits and a mantle of wool so old it had begun to mimic the texture of lichen. The room was barely warmed by the hearth behind him, its coals long since faded to a dull cherry glow. The fire had been rekindled at vespers, but Felric had not noticed its fading. He had been copying a line from a shattered hymn book for over an hour, each stroke more unsure than the last, each word less familiar than it had been the moment before. The letters blurred, not from age or infirmity, but from something subtler, something Felric could not name. The ink seemed to change as he dipped his quill, darkening, then paling, then shifting altogether into something that shimmered faintly in the lamplight, like the wings of a moth just before it turns to ash. He paused, blinked. The phrase on this page had changed, not misspelt, not smudged, changed. The Latin was now mingled with curved strokes and symbols he had only seen once before, half buried in a ruined gospel from the west. The sort of marks that moved when no one looked at them directly. Felric sat back in his chair, the worn joints of the frame creaking beneath his weight. He glanced towards the high window slit, but it had long been devoured by fog. The light beyond was grey and indistinct. The hour still hung heavy in that timeless stretch before dawn, when sleep thins and the veil between things stirs. Somewhere deep in his memory, a story returned. He hadn't thought of it in decades. An old tale whispered by the abbots when the wine had flowed too freely and the ink had run dry. If the mist comes before the hell, do not write your name. If the words forget themselves, do not answer aloud. If the letters turn to stars, leave them be. For the word has opened its ledger, and it always writes in silence first. He had always taken it for a metaphor, a fable to keep the novitiate from wandering into heretical texts or dreaming too boldly over the margins of sacred scrolls. Now, sitting in the hush of the scriptorium, the tale felt less like a warning, more like an instruction. The letters on the page shimmered once more, then stilled. Felric set down his quill. He could feel the weight of something shifting in the floor beneath him, in the breath of the walls. It was not fear he felt, not exactly. It was a memory, curling back into the room like smoke. The scriptorium, once the pride of a Roman villa's atrium, now felt like a tomb, beautiful in its decay, but heavy with the silence that no longer inspired contemplation. The plastered walls, once lined with frescoes and hung with the oils of long-forgotten patrons, had faded to bare, chalky memory, their past lives flaking away with every season. The roof had sagged slightly where the southern beam had split. The ivy crept in through the cracks, tracing slow runes in green along the edge of the lintel. Walls that had once echoed with the voices of senators, philosophers and wine merchants, names long since erased from marble, now held only breath and dust. Felric had loved the sound of the quill on parchment, the steady scratch like an oath being bound, a quiet and decisive rhythm that seemed to affirm the world with each letter. It was, to him, the closest thing left to divine speech, a sound that meant something had been remembered. On most nights it brought him comfort, a sense of continuity in a world slipping between faiths and crowns. But tonight even that sound felt muted, as though the ink itself had lost interest in being written, or the walls had grown tired of witnessing what passed for truth. He leaned back from his desk, his bones creaking louder than the chair beneath him, and rubbed his eyes with fingers long stained by iron gall. The candle before him burned steadily, but the flame was narrow, too still and too pointed. Then, just as he exhaled, it flickered. Not from a draught. The windows were long since shuttered, and the air still, but in rhythm, a subtle spreading hesitation, as though the flame had become to count something in a language older than numbers. He paused, eyes narrowing. For a moment he thought he had heard sound in the distance, something slow and deep. Perhaps a toll or a chime too low for the ear but heavy enough for the marrow. He tilted his head and held his breath, listening past the hearth, past the walls to the bones of the building itself, but there was no sound. Nothing but the rasp of his own breath and the echo of the ink dying on the page. Still, he felt it. A rhythm. Pattern. Not something you could trace or explain, but something familiar. Nonetheless, it was not heard, not truly, but remembered. The pattern pressed into him not by experience, but by the stone beneath his feet. The kind of rhythm that older monks spoke of in parables, murmured beside graves, never written down. The kind of rhythm that might have come from a bell, or from what waited beneath it. Earlier that week, Brother Caelwyn, the abbey's novice and its most enthusiastic would-be renovator, had begun prying up old floor stones in the eastern corridor. He had some theory about a lost subcrypt or buried baptistry. Felric had scolded him at the time, but had done so with the tired smile of a man who had already seen it a dozen, as such obsessions fade into the season. Yet it was from one of these upheaved stones that Felric had retrieved the scroll now resting beside his lamp, a thing not catalogued in the abbey's index, not recognised in any scriptural ledger, not even known to the elder monks who claimed, with wavering pride, to have memorised every inch of the abbey's library. The scroll was strange for the first moment. It had not been wrapped in linen, but in something finer, more pale, like parchment, but slightly translucent. Textured more like cured skin than any vellum he had ever handled. Its binding thread was metal, and not iron or copper or bronze. Star metal, perhaps, the sort of thing Roman poets once wrote about and never meant literally. It gleamed faintly blue even in the lamplight, and felt almost warm to the touch, like a coin just taken from a purse carried close to the heart. He had cut the thread carefully, reverently as one might unbind a relic. No sooner had he opened the scroll than he saw the writing flicker.